Before she had a roof, she had a notebook. Before she had a plan, she had a pile of warehouse pallets and the kind of knowledge that doesn't disappear when your life falls apart, it waits. Maya Callahan was 22 when Iron Falls tried to freeze her out. There is a particular kind of cold that Iron Falls, Minnesota produces in the dead of January. Not the clean, sharp cold of a clear night, but a wet, grinding cold that comes off Lake Superior and settles into your bones like death. The locals call it lake effect cold, and they say it with a kind of weary pride, the way people speak about something that has tried to kill them and failed. Maya Callahan had grown up 4 hours south in Harwick, Wisconsin, where winters were hard but manageable, where her father kept the furnace running and the woodpile stocked and the draft sealed with rolled towels along the bottom of every exterior door. She had grown up watching him do these things, watching his hands move with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the language of structures, who could look at a wall and see not just the surface but everything behind it. She had inherited his hands and his eyes, and for a long time, she thought that was enough. She was 20 years old when she arrived at Lakeshore State University on a partial scholarship for architecture, the first person in her family to walk onto a college campus as a student, and she had carried that fact like a second spine, something that held her upright in rooms where she didn't quite belong. She was good at it, not in the polished, theoretical way of students who had grown up visiting museums and reading design history, but in the raw, structural way of someone who had spent summers on job sites, who understood load-bearing logic before she learned the academic term for it. Her professors noticed. Her classmates, most of them, did not know what to make of her. She didn't mind. She was there to learn what she didn't know yet, and she was learning fast. Then her father died. It happened on a Tuesday in March of her sophomore year. Cardiac arrest, no warning, no time, and the world reorganized itself around the absence of him so completely and so suddenly that Maya stood in the hospital parking lot for 45 minutes before she remembered how to get back inside. He had no life insurance. He had a mortgage on the small house in Harwick where she had grown up, a mortgage with 11 years left on it, and her mother, grieving and overwhelmed and trusting, in the way that people who have never needed a lawyer tend to trust, signed the sale paperwork 3 weeks later on the advice of someone who was not her lawyer, because she believed it was the only option. It was not the only option. Maya found this out 4 months later, after the house had transferred to a new owner, after the legal window to contest had closed, after the thing that could not be undone had been undone. She did not tell her mother what she had found out. There was no point. Her mother had moved to Iowa to live with her sister, and the house in Harwick had new curtains in the windows, and some things, once broken, do not benefit from a detailed accounting of exactly how they broke. Maya left school, not dramatically, not with a scene. She simply stopped registering for the next semester, packed what fit into one duffel bag and one backpack, and stayed in Iron Falls because it was the only city she knew, because she was 21 years old and still believed that trying hard enough was a form of protection. She found 3 jobs. She worked all 3 of them. The rent in Iron Falls had climbed 40% since 2020, a fact that appeared in a city council report that no one on the council seemed particularly alarmed by. She was short $200 a month. She held on for 4 months before she couldn't. She was 21 years old. On the October night, she carried her 2 bags out of the last apartment she would rent for the next 4 years, and the temperature was already dropping, and the lake effect cold was already building over Superior to the northeast, and she stood on the sidewalk outside the building and felt something she would later struggle to name. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something that lived between the two, something that had teeth. The Iron Falls Emergency Shelter Network was, on paper, a functioning system. There was Covenant House North on Birch Avenue, 40 beds designated for women, priority given to mothers with children under 12. There was St. Bridget's Emergency Shelter on the east side, 28 beds, lottery-based, weekly drawing every Monday at 5 p.m. There was the Harbor, a domestic violence shelter that Maya walked to on her 3rd night on the street, not because she had experienced domestic violence, but because she was cold and desperate and had heard someone mention it at the Covenant House intake desk. The woman at the harbor intake was not unkind. She explained, carefully and without cruelty, that the harbor required documented history of intimate partner violence or a referral from law enforcement. Maya did not have those things. She thanked the woman and walked back out into 23-degree air and stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching her breath. She learned the lottery system at St. Bridget's on her first Monday in the city's shelter network, standing in a line of 46 people, her duffel bag between her feet, trying not to make eye contact in a way that communicated anything. 11 names were drawn. Hers was not among them. She learned to read the system the way she had learned to read job sites, by watching, by noting what was real versus what was written in the intake brochure, by understanding that the gap between the two was where most people fell. The gap was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Iron Falls was running 300 beds short of the minimum threshold for single adults without dependents, a number that appeared in the city's own annual homeless services report, buried in Appendix B, cited in a font size that suggested no one expected anyone to read it. The advocates who did read it had been raising the alarm for 6 years. The budget allocation had increased by 4% over that same period, which was less than inflation. Maya did not know these statistics in her first weeks. She learned them later at the public library, where she spent her days, because the library was warm and free and did not ask you to prove anything. What she knew in those early weeks was simpler and more immediate. On any given night, she either had a place to sleep or she didn't, and the lottery determined which, and the lottery was indifferent to the cold. She won a 28-day bed at St. Bridget's on her third attempt in December. She was assigned to a lower bunk in a room with 7 other women. She was grateful in a way that embarrassed her. The depth of her gratitude for a mattress and a roof felt like evidence of something she didn't want to examine too closely. On the 19th night of her stay, she came back from her dinner shift at the restaurant where she still worked part-time and found her bunk occupied by another woman. A new intake volunteer had misread the assignment sheet. The grievance process, she was told, required 72 hours to resolve. The temperature outside that night was 14 below 0 Fahrenheit. Wind chill put it at 31 below. Maya spent the next 3 nights cycling through a 24-hour gas station, restroom 2 blocks from St. Bridget's, sleeping in 90-minute intervals, waking herself with the phone alarm she kept on low battery, washing her face in the sink before the morning shift worker arrived. She did not cry during those 3 nights. She was past crying by then. Past the stage where emotion presented as emotion. It had compressed into something harder, something that sat in her chest like a closed fist, and she carried it forward because there was nothing else to do with it. The difference between looking at something and seeing it is about the framework you bring to the act of looking, the vocabulary your mind reaches for when your eyes send it information. Maya Callahan had grown up with a particular fluency in structures taught to her not in classrooms, but on job sites and in her father's truck, and on Saturday mornings when he would drive through neighborhoods, pointing at houses and explaining what was behind the siding, what was holding the ridge beam, why that roof would fail in 20 years and that one would last 60. She had added to that vocabulary in 2 years of architecture school, filling in the formal language for things she already knew instinctively, learning to write down what her hands had always understood. And then she had stopped adding to it, and for over a year, moving through the city's shelter system and its edges, she had carried it around like a tool belt she couldn't use, because there was nothing to build and no reason to think about building anything. It was a Tuesday in November 2022, early evening, temperature dropping towards single digits, and Maya was sheltering from the wind behind the loading dock of Frontier Supply Co. on Voss Industrial Road. She came here most evenings, during the quiet hour between the last warehouse truck and the overnight security check, because the overhang was wide and the dumpsters blocked the northwest wind and nobody bothered her. The pallets had always been there. She had sat near them dozens of times, without registering them as anything other than background. But that evening, something shifted. The way a word you have said 100 times will suddenly feel strange in your mouth, suddenly demand examination. She looked at the stack. She did not see garbage. She saw cavities. She saw stringer blocks and deckboard spacing and trapped air and load paths. She saw, in the geometry of a discarded shipping pallet, every principle she had ever learned about why a wall keeps heat on one side and cold on the other. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the one thing she had carried, without questioning why she carried it. A soft-cover composition notebook, its pages swollen slightly from one encounter with rain, filled with her own handwriting from her second year at Lakeshore State. Thermal resistance values, vapor pressure differentials, notes on R-value stacking and ground heat loss, and the physics of still air as insulator. She had packed it the night she left the last apartment without knowing why. Sitting behind the Frontier Supply loading dock with her back against a cold concrete wall, she finally understood why. She opened to a blank page at the back and began to calculate, not dreaming, not hoping, calculating volume, surface area, insulation thickness, heat loss rate per hour. She worked for 2 hours in the fading light and then in the orange wash of the dock's security lamp, and when she was done, she had a number, with materials she could source for free or nearly free. In a space she had already identified as available, she could build a structure that would maintain an interior temperature at least 25 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient and sustained cold below zero. The number was not comfort. The number was survival. And survival, she had learned over 14 months, was not a small thing. Maya had 8 days before the first hard freeze of 2022, and she used all of them with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who had learned that panic was a form of waste. The first morning, before anything else, she walked 4 miles to the Iron Falls Public Library on Center Street, signed into a computer terminal with her library card, one of the few cards in her wallet that still represented something functional, and spent 3 hours researching. She needed to know 2 things: which pallets were safe to use and which were not, and how to cut wood without a saw. The first question had a clean answer. Pallet stamped HT, heat-treated, were structurally sound and chemically safe. Pallet stamped MB, methyl bromide, were fumigated with a pesticide that absorbed into the wood and off-gassed in enclosed spaces. She photographed the reference page with her phone. The second question required more digging, and she found it in a woodworking forum thread from 2011. Score the cut line deeply with a utility knife. Repeat from both sides. Then apply lateral pressure along a hard edge. It worked on pallet deck boards, which were typically 3/4 of an inch thick. She tested it that afternoon behind the Frontier loading dock with a utility knife she bought for $3 at a dollar store. It worked with effort. Each cut required a minimum of 8 passes on each face before the board would snap cleanly, and the knife blade dulled after 4 boards, which was a limitation, she noted. She recorded the technique in her composition book, the way her professors had taught her to note things: method, material, limitation, application. The material budget for the entire project came to $23. She documented every item: 2 tarps from the dollar store on Route 7, $11. 3 corrugated metal panels from a salvage yard on Route 9, $12. Everything else, 22 HT pallets from Frontier Supply Co., whose warehouse manager shrugged and said, "Take as many as you want." 6 cinder blocks from a demolition site on Mill Street with a free material sign. 2 damaged straw bales from Ridgeway Feed Store, whose owner kept them behind the loading dock because it was cheaper than hauling them. Everything else cost her nothing but time and the willingness to ask. She began with the floor. Because the floor was where most improvised structures failed, and because she understood, from both her father's teaching and her own coursework, that the ground in a Minnesota winter was not neutral. It was aggressive. She set the 6 cinder blocks in 2 parallel rows, created a 7-inch air gap between the pallet floor and the frozen ground, packed out gravel underneath for drainage, and stretched the vapor barrier nylon over the pallet surface with the edges turned up 4 inches along the future wall lines, creating a sealed basin. Then the walls went up, pallets vertical, screwed at corners with 3-inch screws driven into exposed stringer blocks. No give. She packed every internal cavity with straw, compressing it in 3-inch layers with her forearm, because she knew that large air pockets convected and small ones did not, and the difference was the difference between insulation and decoration. On the fourth night, she heard footsteps. 3 young men, maybe 17 or 18, came around the corner with the loose, testing energy of people who had not yet decided what they intended to do. One of them kicked the partially assembled east wall. It held. He kicked it again. She watched without moving from where she sat on the cinder blocks, and she felt the closed fist in her chest tighten, and she did not speak. They left. 40 minutes later, when she had gone back to work in the dark, one of them came back alone. He was tall and angular, with the kind of face that was still becoming itself. And he didn't say anything. He just picked up one end of the pallet she was trying to position and held it steady while she drove the screws. They worked together for 3 hours without exchanging a word. And when it was done, he set down his end carefully and walked away. And Maya stood alone in the dark with a nearly finished shelter and no idea what had just happened. And she felt something loosen slightly in the fist inside her chest. Some small knot of the assumption she'd been building that the world was entirely without gesture. The first morning Maya woke up inside the shelter, the temperature outside was 8 below 0 Fahrenheit. She knew this because she had bought a small digital thermometer at the dollar store on Route 7 for $2, the kind with a wired outdoor probe, and placed one probe outside through a small gap in the tarp and kept the display unit inside on the floor beside her sleeping bag. Outside, 8 below. Inside, 19 above. A differential of 27 degrees, produced by no energy source other than her own body heat and the physics of still air trapped in wood and straw. She lay in her sleeping bag and looked at the ceiling, the underside of the corrugated metal panels, beaded with condensation at the edges but dry at the center, and felt something she did not have a word for at the time. Something that was not quite pride, and not quite relief, and not quite grief. She had built a thing that worked. She wrote the temperature readings in her composition book, dated them, noted the weather conditions. She did this every morning for the next 4 years. The record she built was not sentimental. It was data. The shelter stood through the first winter without structural failure. In the fall of 2023, before the second freeze, she re-tarped the exterior, replaced straw in the north wall that had compressed and absorbed moisture, checked the vapor barrier, tightened every corner screw. She added rigid foam board salvaged from the demolition of a commercial cold storage unit on Industrial Boulevard, the kind used in walk-in freezers, with an R value of 6 per inch over the vapor barrier on the floor. She added a piece of carpet she had asked for and received from a flooring shop on Main Street that was replacing a showroom installation. The floor by the second winter held heat the way a cast iron pan holds heat, slowly, stubbornly, against sustained pressure. By the third winter, she was not the only one who had built. Donna, 61 years old, 7 years on the street, hands that shook slightly in the cold, had watched Maya work from a distance through most of the second fall, saying nothing, occasionally asking a question in the flat, careful tone of someone who has been disappointed by answers enough times to budget her hope carefully. She worked, and when Donna asked a question, she answered it directly, without condescension, as she would have answered a colleague on a job site. By November of year 3, Donna had built her own structure 6 feet from Maya's elevated floor and straw-packed walls and shingled tarp, and it held through that winter at readings that matched Maya's within 4 degrees. There were 4 more structures in the encampment by February, built by people who had watched and asked and done. Maya's composition notebook, passed from hand to hand in the encampment, photocopied page by page at the library for 10 cents a sheet, the copies held together with binder clips that people contributed from forgotten office supplies. No one called it anything. It was just the notebook. In the winter of 2025, the polar vortex that had been forecast on the Weather Service app, Maya checked at the library, arrived and delivered sustained wind chills of 47 below zero for 6 consecutive days. Inside Maya's shelter, on the coldest of those nights, the thermometer read 16 above. She was 25 years old, and she was alive, and she wrote the reading down. Professor Carl Hendricks had taught sustainable construction at Lakeshore State for 15 years, and he had developed a particular kind of professional fatigue, not burnout exactly, but a dulling of the edges, a sense that the concepts he taught were becoming increasingly abstract, increasingly untethered from the physical reality of building things in actual weather for actual people. He ran a field observation seminar every spring in which he took students through the city to document construction techniques in the built environment. And on a Thursday afternoon in April 2024, one of his students, a second year named Marcus, who had a good eye and an irritating tendency to photograph things without first understanding why they were interesting, showed him a picture on his phone. The picture was of a low structure set back in a gap between two older buildings on the north edge of the Voss Industrial Corridor. Even in a slightly blurry phone photograph, something about it was immediately and visibly different from every other improvised structure Hendricks had seen documented in 15 years of teaching. The tarp was shingled. The floor was elevated on block supports. The wall material, whatever it was, had a density and a precision that spoke of someone who understood that a wall was not a barrier but a system. He stared at the photograph longer than he expected to. Then he said, "Who built that?" Marcus didn't know. Hendricks found the encampment the following Tuesday, walked the perimeter once with his hands in his coat pockets, and then knocked on the door of the structure in the photograph the way you knock on the door of any building where someone lives. Maya opened the door. She was 24, red-haired, and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has learned that people who approach you with interest rarely intend what you hope they intend. He introduced himself. She didn't say her name. He asked if she had built the structure. She said yes. He asked if he could see the floor system. She stepped back from the door, not welcoming him in exactly, but not refusing either, giving him enough space to make his own choice about whether to enter. He entered, and he stood on the carpet over foam over vapor barrier floor and looked at the straw-packed wall sections exposed at a corner she had left unfinished for ventilation testing, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he unrolled a set of drawings he had carried under his arm, actual blueprints, a residential project he was consulting on, mixed-income housing, currently in design development, and spread them on the floor between them. He pointed to the wall section detail and said, "What do you see here that could be better?" Maya looked at the drawings for a moment. Then she sat down cross-legged on the floor, pulled the drawings closer, and began to talk. Not nervously, not gratefully, the way a person talks when they are finally in a conversation that is at the right level. Hendricks sat down across from her and listened, and he looked at her the way he looked at his best students, with the attentive respect of someone who has just realized they are in the presence of someone who knows something he needs to know. The notice appeared on a Tuesday morning in November 2025, white paper stapled to a wooden stake driven into the frozen ground at the encampment's entrance. City seal at the top, 14 days to vacate. Zoning violation code cited in the formal language of administrative indifference. Maya had known it was coming before the stake appeared, because Tyler, the tall, angular young man who had held pallets for her in the dark in 2022, and whose name she had learned only months later when he came back a second time to help re-tarp the east wall and introduced himself without ceremony, the way people introduce themselves when they have already established that words between them are not required, now worked as a facilities attendant at Iron Falls City Hall. He had spent the years between moving through the kind of work that Iron Falls offered to people without degrees. Warehouse shifts, then maintenance, then a facilities position at the city. He had seen the variance review paperwork cross the desk of the planning department 3 weeks earlier and had walked to the encampment on his lunch break to tell her. He handed her a folded photocopy without saying much, which was consistent with how he communicated everything in the spare, deliberate way of someone who had learned early that words were not free. She thanked him. He nodded and walked back toward downtown with his hands in his jacket pockets, and she stood holding the photocopy and felt the closed fist in her chest again. The same one from the gas station bathroom, from the shelter lottery, from the parking lot outside the hospital in Harwick, but something was different. This time, the fist was not just compressed emotion. This time, it had a use. She spent the 5 days before the notice became public knowledge doing two things in parallel. The way a good builder manages two trades on the same job site. She packed her tools and materials into portable form, staged for movement, tarp folded, straw source, identified at the new location she had already scouted, notebook copied twice at the library, and copies stored in a waterproof bag. And she wrote. She sat at the library on Center Street for 9 hours across 3 days and produced 12 pages, handwritten and then typed on the library's public computer, a technical document that began with a site description and ended with a cost-benefit table, comparing the encampment's thermal infrastructure against the per-bed operating cost of the city's emergency shelter system. The math was not flattering to the city. The total material cost for all 5 structures in the encampment combined was $340. The city spent approximately $68 per night per bed in its emergency shelter system, a figure any resident could find in the annual report at the library reference desk. She attached her temperature records, 4 years of morning readings, dated, weather correlated, and 3 hand-drawn section diagrams of the wall system, floor system, and roof assembly, drawn in the drafting notation she had learned at Lakeshore State. She sent it to Dana Wexler, the freelance photographer who had photographed the encampment 2 years earlier and asked questions Maya had been careful not to fully answer. She attached a note that said only, "You can use this however you think is right." "I won't be here in 2 weeks." Dana read it that evening. She called an editor in Chicago she had been pitching sustainable housing stories to for 2 years. And she sent the document as an attachment, and the editor responded at 7 the following morning. "When can we talk?" Professor Hendricks brought a photocopy of Maya's notebook to his sustainable construction seminar on a Thursday morning in February 2026, 3 months after the encampment had been cleared and 2 weeks after the Chicago article had run. He set it on the seminar table without introduction and asked his 22 students to spend 15 minutes reading it before he said anything. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms are quiet when people are genuinely reading, not skimming. The quality of the silence changed as they moved through the pages, became denser somehow, more attentive. A student named Rachel, who was one of the better technical minds in the cohort, looked up after 10 minutes and said, "Who wrote this?" Hendricks told them. He told them everything. He did not editorialize. He let the facts perform their own argument. He did not editorialize. He let the facts perform their own argument. After class, 3 students stayed behind. Not to ask about Maya. They stayed because something in the seminar had opened a door that was apparently already slightly ajar. The first student, a junior named Kevin, said that he was 3 months behind on rent and had been working night shifts at a fulfillment center while carrying a full course load and was not sure how much longer he could sustain both. The second, a sophomore named Priya, said she had been couch surfing since October when her off-campus apartment building had converted to short-term rentals and her lease had not been renewed. The third said nothing specific, only that reading the notebook had made her feel less alone in a way she found difficult to explain. Hendricks sat in his office that afternoon with those 3 conversations arranged in his mind and felt something clarify that had been building for a long time. The distance between his students and the population he had spent 2 weeks explaining to his department was not the distance he had assumed. It was much smaller. It was, in some cases, a few months of financial pressure, a lease not renewed, a shift manager who cut hours at the wrong moment. He went home that evening and drafted a proposal for the Lakeshore State Academic Affairs Committee, a credit recognition pathway for students with demonstrable applied knowledge in construction, sustainable systems, or related fields, evaluated by portfolio and practical assessment rather than credit transfer. He was careful about how he framed it, not as charity, not as accommodation, as academic honesty, an acknowledgement that knowledge existed in forms the institution had not previously chosen to recognize, and that choosing not to recognize it was a policy decision, not a factual one. The committee review process was projected to take 6 months. In those 6 months, Maya Callahan was sleeping in a room she rented for $600 a month in a house she shared with 4 other people on the east side of Iron Falls, working 2 jobs, and checking the library computer twice a week for updates on the proposal she had been told about by Hendricks, who had called her and explained it and asked if she had any objections. She had said she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 days and called back with conditions. Tyler Oakes was 19 years old in the fall of 2022, which was the first detail he included when Dana Wexler tracked him down and asked if he would speak with her for the follow-up piece she was developing. After the Chicago article ran, he said it not to establish sympathy, but context. He wanted her to understand who he was the night he went back to help, because he was not sure he fully understood it himself. He had grown up in Iron Falls, in a 2-bedroom house on the north side where the heating got cut every January and February when his mother couldn't make the utility payment, where he had learned to sleep in a particular way, fully dressed, with a second blanket folded and placed where he could reach it without opening his eyes, a preparation so habitual that he still did it in summer. He was not unhoused. He was cold, which is a different condition and a less visible one. He had gone to the Voss Industrial Corridor that night in November 2022 with 2 other boys and the unfocused, restless energy of someone who was angry about something he couldn't name. He had kicked the wall. He was not proud of it. He had walked away and then stopped walking. And what stopped him was something he saw in the way Maya did not react. She did not flinch, did not bargain, did not do any of the things he had watched people do when confronted with aggression. She just waited, with a quality of patience that was not submission. That was something more structural, like a wall-absorbing force. He had not known what to call it then. He called it now, to Dana simply. She wasn't afraid of hard things. He had gone back and held the pallet because he wanted to be in the presence of that. Not to help, or not only to help, to learn how it looked from close up. He read the Chicago article on his phone during a break at City Hall, recognized the shelter description, recognized the temperature data, and sat for a long time in the break room with the phone in his hands and the particular feeling of having been part of something whose full dimensions he had not understood at the time. He contacted Dana through the publication's website. When Dana included his account in the follow-up piece, the passage most widely quoted was this one, which she read back to him before publishing. He had said that the night in the Voss Industrial Corridor was the first time he had watched someone refuse to stop, working in the cold, and that he had needed to see that, and that he had not known he needed it until he saw it. After the piece ran, Maya's mother, who had moved to Cedar Falls, Iowa, with her sister after selling the house in Harwick, saw a link shared on a Facebook group for Wisconsin expats and read the article in full, and then sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she picked up her phone. Maya answered on the second ring. The call lasted 4 hours. Neither of them discussed its contents with anyone else, and this was, in its own way, a form of privacy that the previous 4 years had largely denied Maya Callahan, and she held it carefully, the way you hold a thing that is both very new and very old. In the spring of 2026, Maya Callahan was 27 years old, which is younger than most people assume when they hear the preceding 9 stages of this story, because our instinct is to assign the years that suffering takes from a person to the person's chronological age rather than to the suffering. She was 27 and renting a room on the east side of Iron Falls and working a daytime shift at a building supply company that had hired her on the strength of a reference from Professor Hendricks and her demonstrable ability to read structural drawings, which her employer had discovered in the first week when she corrected a specification error in a contractor's order without being asked. She had been offered the first enrollment slot in the credit recognition pathway that Lakeshore State Academic Affairs Committee approved in March of that year. The pathway that Hendricks had spent 6 months lobbying for, that had been debated and refined and finally approved on a 7-2 committee vote. She called Hendricks and told him she would accept the slot under 3 conditions. First, the program could not be named after her or publicly described as originating from her case. Second, the eligibility criteria could not include any reference to housing status, past or present. Third, the practical assessment component had to be developed with input from at least 2 people who had acquired their knowledge outside institutional settings. and she would provide names. Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would bring her conditions to the committee. The committee deliberated for 3 weeks and agreed to all 3. On the last night before she moved into the room, the night she spent in the shelter she had built in the fall of 2022, Maya did not dismantle it. It was still structurally sound, retarped the previous October, floor barrier intact, straw freshly replaced in the west wall where she had detected moisture absorption in December. She made one addition before she left, a single sheet of paper, sealed in a plastic sleeve from a dollar store craft kit, taped to the interior of the pallet door at eye height. It said, "This structure was built correctly and has survived 4 winters. If you are reading this, you need it more than I do. Spare screws under the northeast floor corner. Replace the straw every fall before first freeze. The library on Center Street has the full technical notes. Ask for the binder at the reference desk. It is free." She signed it with her first name only. Maya's structure sat at the far edge of the encampment's boundary, set back between 2 older buildings on private industrial property that the city's vacate order did not cover, a detail she had chosen deliberately when she first identified the site 4 years earlier, and one that the planning department's paperwork had not caught. Nobody knows who slept there the following winter, or the winter after that. What is known is that Dana Wexler, driving past the Voss Industrial Corridor in January 2026, slowed her car and photographed the structure from the road. In the photograph, a faint light was visible through the gap at the base of the door. Something inside was producing warmth. The knowledge had not gone anywhere. It had just found the next person who needed it. If this story moves something in you, hit like and subscribe so more people find it. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of Maya's story hit hardest and where in the world you are watching from.